You're listening to the Sermon Podcast for the Peak Church, located in Apex, North Carolina. Our church is striving to welcome all who are feeling disconnected from God. And so our hope is that over the next several minutes, you will connect with the God that we are talking about, and you'll resonate deeply with the life that this God wants for you. We hope you enjoy.
Well, good morning, the Peak Church. It's so good to be with you all this morning. I love this idea of the series, Keep Christianity Weird. I have a 16-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son, and they love to give me a hard time about how weird I am. Actually, my daughter loves to say that she gets secondhand embarrassment just showing up in spaces with me or watching me. My 11-year-old would use the word cringe, but I'm quite embarrassing to my kids with how weird I am. But I think this is such an interesting topic to be unpacking all of the things in our world that would make it weird to be a Christian. And one of those things to me is this profound idea that there's something in this text, there's something in the way of following Jesus about our interconnectedness and specifically about our bodies. Right? You think about even this practice that we engage regularly of the body broken open, of blood poured out for us. And so I want to begin with one of the ways that I sort of process profound realities is through writing poetry. And I just want to read you like a poem-ish reflection as I was sitting in this idea this week. How profound it is that we live in bodies with spirit, this flesh and blood reality of being souls with skin suits. I shared with you, I have 2 kids, and how they came into the world is strange enough. It's quite wild to me that while I had never done it before, my body could labor for 40 hours until until she was born, and then all of a sudden my body knew exactly what to do to be able to provide sustenance for her, the exact precise nutrients she needed for the first 6 months of her life with nothing else. And this is the reality for each one of us, the sheer dependence and vulnerability of it blows my mind. Or the profound mystery of how babies are made, right? This is quite wild and typically a really fun exchange we perform with our animal bodies and can literally create life like gods and goddesses, creators who have the power to give and take life, to create bodies. The sheer audacity and profound mystery of that. Although it's worth recognizing that sometimes that animal body function happens in this world in ways that strip one of agency and dignity. And there are folks like me whose very life is the product of that type of violence, an accident never intended to be. Likely, the result of untended pain for generations that led this man's own sort of dehumanization and the pain in a life that was so unbearable, he couldn't face it, and so he chose to take that out on someone else, never intending to create this life of mine from his shame. The sheer scandal of it. Or when my son was born, he was just a tiny guy, and I had a boss who was a pastor who advised presidents and flew around on private jets and was considered a very important person. And when I addressed his inappropriate comments about my 30-year-old body, he denied and then deflected, and then the organization rejected me and punished me for my truth-telling. And then all of a sudden, dozens of stories began to surface about the skeleton bodies hidden in his closet, their bodies the site of his trespassing, all while the organizational betrayal of elders and leaders obliterated me for wanting boundaries for him. The sheer revealing of it. And see, my indigenous theology has sensibilities that say you can tell what one believes by how they behave with their bodies. All of a sudden, our actions in the church, this space that had shaped me so expansively in my own sort of spiritual evolution, coming from a conservative faith space and entering into a place that showed me what it looks like for men and women to serve side by side, that expanded my understanding of global missions work, that it wasn't just our job to pour out compassion, but to actually advocate for justice and equitability for people, that took me to the Middle East to see up close and personal the conflict and how it was playing out and the implications of this old evangelical eschatology, this end times theory, but the practical implications of my theology on real, actual people. This place was remarkably expansive for me. And then all of a sudden, we're making decisions to protect power, even if it meant leaving a trail of bodies behind the bus. This was not the way of Christ that they taught me, but it revealed what their priorities were, the sheer disorientation of it. For all of us, whether through violence or childhood neglect, overwhelm or stress, our bodies are the sites of pain unimaginable. And they're also the sites of enormous capacity for pleasure, but scars from childhood adventures, whether it's tree climbing or wave diving, the wounds from words that cut deep, sometimes generations of implications from surviving things like displacement, slavery, or the dehumanization of dominance, being parented for obedience, and then family systems that just brush it all under the rug. The gutting realities of what it means to live inside of a body. I love the faith-stretching stories of folks throughout the sacred text who, had kids way beyond the years that they could have ever been expected to have kids, right? We read these throughout the sacred text. Or the ways that we see bodies and lineages that hold significance throughout the stories of Jesus. We have a litany of folks who put their very bodies on the line in resistance to things like genocide, and sex workers who hid the enemy from the other side. And then we have stories of bodies being the very site of a type of power that we can hardly comprehend. This is captivating to me. A body that could touch wounds and heal them, make blind men see, cause paralyzed people to walk free, cause bleeding to cease after years and years of trying everything. The power that sets the bound free in story after story of this love that extends beyond what we can see and beyond what we can fathom, because it goes even to our enemies. I can't unsee the significance of our bodies throughout it all. And then the central story of a body being broken open in resistance to the systems and structures of empire that just kept seeking bigger and bigger and better and bigger and better at all costs, often impacting the bodies of the least of these the most. Resurrection power, and then this word from Jesus that empowers us to be little empires, idols that represent the king as ambassadors of that type of power in the world. We're supposed to be active participants in the power that Christ's resurrection inaugurated in the world, and it somehow mysteriously continues to unfold in and around our bodies, and it's culminating in what we believe is the eventual redemption and restoration of all things, and we get invited to participate in that with our bodies. Keeping Christ weird means being attentive to these things and the ways that we belong to one another and belong to ourselves. There's something that gets missed, and Paul talks about it here in the text. If we don't belong to our whole, full selves, if we don't belong to one another, we miss out on this interconnectedness that when our bodies belong to one another, we actually become the body of Christ in the world. We enact the hands and feet and the redemption and restoration of Jesus to people outside of our context. Paul says here, now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. To each one of us, there's this embodiment, there's this manifestation of goodness that is supposed to be present in and through our bodies. And the work of Christ is incomplete without our active participation, without the part that you are intended to bring. The idea that we belong isn't just sort of a kingdom idea either, right? It's actually a central message in things like neuroscience and psychology. And I want you to know I do as a therapist. I have formal training in the New Testament, but I've gone to enough therapy that if I can offer you anything from the money that I've spent there, I want to offer some reflections. Every body, do you know this from a neuroscience standpoint? Every single body belongs. Physiologically, we belong to one another. Our bodies collectively create what's called this great, complex, harmonious symphony. Each one of us bringing sort of a frequency to the symphony that plays out. Based on our conditioning, based on the stories that we hold, our bodies are interconnected with the bodies of other people. Do you know that our bodies, with this frequency, with our sort of unique nervous system, that our bodies speak to one another? Do you know this? Our nervous systems are formed with how we grew up, and that's the grid through which we perceive the world, but our bodies are perceiving the reality around us way before a thought ever even enters our mind. Quantum physics talks about this idea that the structure of the very universe at the cosmic scale shares a striking similarity to the complex neurons in the human brain. Isn't this profound? The ways that we are interconnected with all things around us. When I found myself after my sort of faith shattering, and I know that's different for people, for some of you, perhaps one sort of thread got pulled and maybe your faith paradigm began to unravel. For some of you, perhaps you had an experience like me and your entire faith paradigm was shattered. But when I was walking through that season and I found I couldn't speak the things of God, I was engaged in some pretty intense trauma healing work, trying to figure out how to move forward from this sort of shattering. And do you know what I discovered is just this profound fingerprint of the divine in our bodies. Things like neuroplasticity. Do you know that you can actually rewire neural pathways in your brain and change the way that you think and the way that you perceive the world around you? It's profound, these sort of divine imprints within our body. When I couldn't speak the things of God, I would just call it the algorithm of the universe. Being attentive to different synchronicities of what was happening around me and how Spirit was leading in my life. Ecologically, we also belong to one another, not just one another and other bodies, but to the entire creation. Do you know that we breathe with the trees? This blows my mind. Like what they breathe out is what we breathe in, and what we breathe out is what they breathe in. There is this profound interconnectedness found deeply within our design. And it begins with us being connected to ourselves and to one another, but we're facing a real challenge with what that means these days, this sort of belonging to self or embodied presence. I read last year that 70 to 80% of Americans are living in what's called adrenal fatigue. Maybe you feel seen in that, and I want you to know this was pre-election and inauguration data, so I can only imagine, like it has increased since then. 80% of Americans living in adrenal fatigue, which means you have hit what they call allostatic load. You have taken in so much stress and overwhelm, you cannot take any more in, and your nervous system is just functioning in fight or flight. Fight or flight or freeze or fawn. And what this feels like to many of us, I don't know if this is your experience, but it feels like being in regular everyday conversation or life and something happens and I get triggered. Do you know this feeling? And it feels like the Hulk is gonna come out of me. Don't pretend that you don't have this. Please tell me I am not the only one. Sometimes it's in a conversation with my kids or in traffic when somebody cuts me off and I want to like ram into their car. Do you know what I'm saying? And what I'm learning about these triggers from a trauma organization that I did some work with is that they say a trigger hits you, and if you have a response that's bigger than the thing in front of you, they say if it's hysterical, it's historical. It's some point of wound or pain that's playing out in our story. It's something historical. And I don't love the way that hysterical gets used to sort of like diminish emotionality in women. So I've added to it and I say if it's hostile, it's historical. because that's how I tend to experience when shame comes up in the men in my life whom I love. They get triggered and it comes out as shame. Whether it's hysterical or hostile, it's historical. There's some other pain or wound or trigger that's getting flicked at with whatever it is that's in front of us. And as long as we're operating at this sort of allostatic load, disconnected, disembodied, those stories are driving us day in and day out. And those stories are different for each one of us, right? Perhaps like me, it's your faith family of origin story. Maybe you grew up in a conservative faith space like the SBC was mine, or an evangelical faith paradigm where it was this sort of like fear-based, shame-oriented behavior modification for hell avoidance. And they unintentionally gave you like a spiritual prosperity gospel, right? If you do X plus Y, it'll equal Z and it will go well with you. And then real life hit, and all of a sudden, that faith paradigm didn't work anymore. You had to be and believe specific things to belong there and actually cut off parts of yourself, right? What does it look like to remember these parts of ourselves that we have cut off in former spaces for the sake of belonging? And maybe for you, it's not a faith space that you were formed in. Maybe it's just your family of origin. Maybe you grew up in a home where there were not adults that could be present to your needs. Maybe you dropped a drink and spilled it and got screamed at when you were a kid. And ever since that moment, your 11-year-old self got yelled at, you have been attempting to be a perfectionist so that you could earn or prove love. Our families of origin hold these stories. And cultured bring up these stories, these wounds that are inviting us to tend to them. And do you know what happens when we don't tend to them? We end up doing things like disassociating and disconnecting because of the pain and discomfort of them, right? Whether that's eating disorders or pornography or just disassociation, trying to disconnect, or drinking, what I'm finding is that things that were once talked about as sin are most often trauma. And what I'm finding is instead of saying, what's wrong with you, when you say to somebody, what happened to you, all of a sudden every adaptive pattern they have ever reached for begins to make sense. When you understand someone's story and their history, we can have a lot more compassion and an invitation. This is the invitation of the gospel, is to be people who belong to ourselves. Pete Scazzaro is a psychologist and an author, and he says, you can have Jesus in your heart, but you still have grandpa in your bones. We have these sort of traumas that live in our bodies at the cellular level. And friends, they get passed down and passed down and passed down until we tend to the pain of them and heal them. What if rather than our belonging being rooted in like believing specific things and behaving in certain ways, what if our belonging was actually rooted at its core in our belovedness? When I worked through that journey of not being able to speak the things of God, a lot of my sort of spiritual practices also fell to the wayside, but I was so compelled by this person of Jesus, and I was doing this trauma healing work and discovering things like neuroplasticity and the imprints of the divine through the algorithm of the universe, and I was really trying to figure out what are the things that I believe. And do you know what I discovered before that story where they tell you like you're totally depraved and totally broken and there is nothing that you can ever do to be good enough? Do you know before that, God talks about how God created all things and then created humans as the crown of creation, and then looked at the crown of creation and said, you are good. You are so, so good. And then unlike the gods of the ancient Near East at that time, who would create little idols, little wooden and stone representations that were to be worshipped and to show who has dominion over these people, our God, the creator of the cosmos, says, I'm going to put my image, my idol in each one of you, and you are going to be the representation of the character and nature of God. Do you know what this means? Is that I don't need to belong to you if you're a certain well put together version of yourself. This means that when you fully belong to yourself and operate from that place of belovedness, you reveal to me unique, distinct characteristics of God that my impression of the image of God is actually incomplete without. What would it look like to have that sense of belovedness such that we felt safe enough to come home to ourselves, to belong to ourselves, to remember those parts of ourselves that we have lobbed off for the sake of belonging in previous paradigms? Jesus gives us this invitation to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and then says the second commandment is just like it. It's to love your neighbor as yourself. And I don't know what your capacity for loving yourself looks like, but I'm finding I have a lot of stories in my body around having needs. And I think many of us do. Men and women are certainly socialized and cultured differently on this, but rather than sort of spiritual disciplines these days, I'm really invested in practicing spiritual devotions in my life. How am I devoting my practices towards embodying my belovedness? And what does that look like for you? Is it taking walks with someone you love? Is it taking the time to think your thoughts and feel your feelings? Probably the most inconvenient part about that way I embody my belovedness is how often my feelings want to come out of my eyeballs, and I do not love to cry. I don't know how you feel about that. But taking the time to practice our belovedness changes how we show up in the world to the people that we love most, right? Embodying our belovedness, one of the practices in my journey there that I want to hand to you is just this idea of, we pay attention to triggers because they get our attention, but what we often miss is what they call glimmers, which are sort of the opposite of triggers. What are those moments for you throughout the day when you feel yourself sort of come home for a minute? I love when I see deer when I'm out on a walk. I'm like a kid. I get so excited about it. Or when my kids will hug me. Or that moment when your body goes, it's like the moment that your soul catches up with your body. And being attentive to glimmers, being attentive to those moments that I come home to myself, it's sort of changing how I experience my own self and the world around me. It's changing how I'm attempting to show up embodying my belovedness such that the pain of those wounds that I carry in my body, that each one of us, our bodies hold these stories. When we don't tend to those, do you know what happens? We get triggered and they sort of poison. They reactively sort of reverberate after us. We perpetuate them, and most often the consequences are leaked all over the people that we love the most. But do you know what happens when we're people who tend to those places inside of us, those wounds, those stories that we carry? They actually can get metabolized, and our wounds actually become wisdom that can help heal the world. Like at the nervous system level, at the cellular level, fundamentally at the collective level, when we do that work, we're healing ourselves and those we love most, and we're contributing to the redemption and restoration of the entire world. It's an invitation for us to belong to ourselves and to one another, to all of creation, to do the work to practice embodying our belovedness. And when we do that, we become the body of Christ. We become redemptive presence in the world. This is the invitation for us to reorient. This is what it looks like to, generational sin we see talked about throughout the Old Testament. Generational trauma is a very real thing, scientifically and psychologically. What, my friends, would generational healing look like? What I'm finding in this sort of work that I'm doing in my own journey is that I cannot belong to anyone else beyond the extent that I belong to myself, right? And actually, Bell Hooks talks about when we show up to love other people because we need something from them, we're not loving them, we're actually using them. But when I'm practicing my belovedness and living from this place that fully comprehends there is nothing that I need to earn or prove or gain or lose, that I already am loved, it invites me to show up with a different presence in the world. And I think that is the invitation for us. What would it look like to embody your belovedness? To be people who are tending to those most wounded parts and allowing those wounds to become wisdom and medicine that gets unleashed in the world through the collective. One of the most precarious examples of this to me is Robbie and Bassam, friends that I met in Israel, Palestine, on a journey of looking at all of the different sides of this conflict, and each of them have lost children in the conflict. One lost his daughter because an IDF soldier, sniper, killed her by accident. And one lost her son who served in the Israeli Defense Forces. And these two people should, by all definitions, be enemies as this ongoing conflict plays out. And they decided, no, we are not going to respond to violence with violence. We're going to come together and sit in the pain of these wounds. We're going to actually hold space for other people to move beyond retributive imaginations for justice and to come together and hold this pain and actually imagine, what does restorative practice look like out of this? It is profound to me, and their ministry is growing exponentially right now because what continues to happen in this land. And they're saying, no, we are going to embody a different way of being because they see how Christ's presence is made known through how we show up in our bodies. Family, the invitation for us to keep Christianity weird is to be people who show up belonging to ourselves and practicing our belovedness, belonging to one another and perhaps reminding one another of our belovedness at our core, that we might become redemptive presence in the world. If you heard nothing else this morning, my hope is that you would leave here reminded of your belovedness. And I want to invite you, if you would, to close your eyes while I read for you a blessing of belovedness. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my son, the beloved." Beloved, is there any other word needs saying? Any other blessing could compare with this name, this knowing? Beloved. Comes like a mercy to the ear that has never heard it. Comes like a river to the body that has never seen such grace. Beloved. Comes holy to the heart, aching to be made new. Comes healing to the soul, wanting to begin again. Beloved. Keep saying it, and though it may sound strange at first, watch how it becomes part of you, how it becomes you, as if you never could have known yourself anything else, as if you never could have been any other than this. Beloved.
Thank you for listening to the Peak Podcast. Make sure you subscribe wherever podcasts can be found. For more information on how to get connected with our church, please visit us at thepeakchurch.org.